My wife carefully chose a different hotel for her secret affair. She just didn't realize I owned the cameras watching everything. It started as one of those evenings that should have felt perfectly normal. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic drifting in through the kitchen window. I was leaning against the counter, scrolling through emails on my phone, when I heard the familiar click of the front door. "Hey," my wife called gently as she stepped inside. Her voice carried that same warmth it always had, the kind that used to make me smile without thinking. I looked up and saw her standing there, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she slipped off her shoes. She looked beautiful, she always did in that effortless way. Not the loud kind of beauty that demands attention, but something calmer, more confident. The kind that came with experience and quiet self-assurance. She walked toward me and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. "How was your day?" she asked. The touch was warm, familiar. But something about it felt shorter than usual. Like a moment cut off before it had time to settle. "Busy," I said with a small shrug. "Same as always." She nodded, offering a soft smile before moving toward the kitchen table. Her phone was already in her hand, the screen lighting up with another message. That was the first small thing I noticed. She had always used her phone, like everyone does. But lately, it felt different. The way she tilted the screen slightly away. The way her expression softened when she read something, like she was reacting to a private joke I wasn't part of. I tried not to overthink it. Marriage teaches you not to chase every little suspicion. Trust means giving the other person space to exist without constant questions. Still, the feeling lingered. She set her purse down on the chair and walked back toward me. As she passed, a faint scent followed her, something floral, unfamiliar. "New perfume?" I asked casually. She paused for a second. "Oh, yeah," she said, almost too quickly. "A coworker recommended it." She smiled again, but her eyes drifted back toward the phone in her hand. Another notification appeared. The screen lit up briefly, and for a split second I saw her lips curl into a quiet smile before she quickly locked it. That was the second thing I noticed. We ate dinner together like we always did. The conversation wasn't tense or cold. If anything, it was polite, comfortable in that practiced rhythm couples develop over time. But there were small gaps. Moments where she seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. At one point, I reached across the table and brushed my fingers lightly against her hand. She squeezed mine gently. It was a sweet gesture, the kind we'd shared countless times before. But even as she held my hand, her attention flicked back toward the phone resting beside her plate. Later that evening, she stood near the door, adjusting the strap of her bag. "I've got a late meeting tonight," she said. "Probably won't be too long." I nodded, trying to ignore the quiet unease forming in my chest. She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around me in a quick hug. Her cheek brushed against mine, soft and warm. "Don't stay up too late," she murmured. Her fingers squeezed my hand once before she let go. Then she walked out the door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty hallway. Everything had seemed normal. Almost perfectly normal. But something inside me whispered that something had changed, and I just didn't know what yet. Most people who know me don't realize I have anything to do with hotels. On the surface, my life looks pretty ordinary. I work long hours, answer emails, deal with spreadsheets and contracts like anyone else trying to build something stable. What most people don't see is that a few years ago, I invested in several small boutique hotels through a family partnership. They're not giant luxury resorts or anything flashy, just quiet, well-kept places scattered across the city. Comfortable lobbies, warm lighting, polite staff. The kind of places where people check in, spend a night or two, and move on without thinking much about who owns the building. I usually check in on things remotely. Once or twice a week, I log into the management system, review reports, and sometimes glance at the security cameras to make sure everything is running smoothly. It's routine, nothing dramatic, just part of making sure the business stays healthy. That afternoon felt no different. I was sitting at my desk at home, a half-finished cup of coffee beside my laptop, going through the usual reports. Occupancy numbers, maintenance requests, staff schedules. Boring but necessary things. Eventually, I opened the security feed for one of the downtown locations. The lobby camera appeared on my screen. Soft golden lighting filled the room, reflecting off the polished floor. A couple was checking in at the front desk while the receptionist typed something into the computer. Near the window, someone sat quietly reading a magazine. Normal. Completely normal. I almost closed the tab. But then the front doors opened. A woman stepped inside. At first, my brain didn't react. It was just another guest walking into another hotel lobby. But something about the way she moved made me pause. She reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. A small, familiar gesture. My hand froze on the mouse. No, I muttered quietly to myself. The woman walked further into the lobby, glancing around for a moment before approaching the front desk. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but when she turned slightly, the light caught her face. My stomach tightened. It was my wife. For a moment I just stared at the screen, convinced I had to be mistaken. Cities are big. People look similar. Maybe it was someone who simply resembled her. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became. The way she carried herself. The way she adjusted the strap of her purse. Even the way she smiled politely at the receptionist. It was all painfully familiar. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. Okay, maybe there's a reason, I whispered under my breath. Maybe she was meeting a friend. Maybe a coworker had booked a room for some work event. There were plenty of normal explanations. I replayed the footage again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't caught the first time. Before walking to the desk, she glanced over her shoulder toward the entrance, almost like she was checking to see if anyone had followed her. It wasn't an obvious movement. Just a quick look. But it felt deliberate. A quiet, uneasy feeling began forming in my chest. I kept watching as the receptionist handed her a keycard. My wife thanked her with a polite smile and turned toward the elevators. For a second, she stood alone in the lobby. The camera captured her clearly. She checked her phone. Her expression softened instantly. The same small smile I'd noticed at home the night before appeared again, private, warm, almost excited. Then the elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. And the doors closed. I sat there in silence, staring at the now empty lobby on my screen, a strange weight settling in my chest. At that moment, I didn't know what was happening. But something inside me quietly whispered that this wasn't just a coincidence. For a long time after the elevator doors closed behind her, I just sat there staring at the empty lobby feed. Nothing unusual happened. A man walked through the entrance carrying a suitcase. A couple approached the front desk asking about a reservation. The receptionist answered with the same polite smile she always wore. Normal things. Ordinary things. But my mind wasn't focused on any of it. It was stuck on the image of my wife standing in that lobby just minutes earlier, glancing over her shoulder before stepping into the elevator. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe she really was meeting someone for work. Maybe she needed a quiet place to talk about something important. There were dozens of reasonable explanations, and I tried to hold on to every one of them. Still, I didn't close the camera feed. Instead, I switched to another angle. The camera outside the hotel entrance. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Cars passed by occasionally, their reflections sliding across the glass doors. A few pedestrians walked past without paying much attention to the building. I wasn't even sure what I was waiting for. Maybe I just needed to see that nothing else unusual happened. Maybe I wanted proof that my imagination had gotten the better of me. About 15 minutes passed. Then the door opened again. A man stepped inside. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, dressed neatly but casually. Dark jacket, relaxed posture. The kind of person who blended easily into a crowd without drawing attention. He paused just inside the entrance and pulled out his phone. For a moment, he stood there scrolling through something on the screen. Then he typed a message. A few seconds later, he glanced toward the elevators. My chest tightened. It might have meant nothing. People check their phones all the time. People wait for friends, coworkers, business partners. Still, something about the timing made my stomach twist. I switched back to the lobby camera. The man walked across the room with an easy confidence, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He didn't approach the front desk. He didn't ask any questions. He just waited near one of the chairs, glancing occasionally toward the hallway that led to the elevators. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. Then something happened that made my heart sink. From the corner of the lobby, I saw movement. A familiar figure stepped into view. My wife. She walked toward him quickly, her expression changing the moment their eyes met. She smiled. Not the polite smile she gave strangers or coworkers. This one was softer, warmer. The kind of smile you'd give someone you're genuinely happy to see. The man's face lit up too. When they reached each other, he opened his arms slightly, and she stepped forward without hesitation. They hugged. It wasn't a quick greeting. It lasted just a little longer than that. Long enough for something cold to settle in my chest. My hand hovered over the mouse as the footage continued playing. When they finally pulled apart, they stayed close, closer than two people meeting for a casual conversation. The man said something that made her laugh quietly. Then she reached out and touched his arm, her fingers resting there for a moment as they spoke. It was such a small gesture. But it was one I recognized instantly. She used to do that with me all the time when we first started dating. I paused the video. The screen froze on the moment her hand rested lightly on his sleeve. The room around me felt strangely quiet. I stared at the image, hoping, almost begging, for my brain to find another explanation. But deep down, something inside me had already begun to understand what I was seeing. And it was a truth I wasn't ready to face. For several minutes, I just sat there staring at the frozen frame on my laptop. My wife's hand rested lightly on the man's arm, both of them caught mid-conversation. On the screen, they looked comfortable together, relaxed in a way that felt painfully familiar. I knew that posture. That soft smile. That easy closeness. For a moment, I thought about closing the laptop. Just shutting it and walking away. If I stopped watching now, maybe I could pretend this moment didn't mean what it looked like. Maybe I could convince myself there was still some harmless explanation waiting just out of view. But curiosity, and something heavier than curiosity, kept my hand on the mouse. Slowly, I pressed play. The footage resumed. They continued talking for another minute in the lobby. I couldn't hear their voices, but their expressions said enough. She laughed softly at something he said, tilting her head slightly the way she always did when she was amused. Then the man gestured toward the hallway that led to the elevators. My wife nodded. They began walking side by side. I switched to the hallway camera. The lighting there was softer, casting long shadows along the carpeted floor. The two of them walked close together, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they moved. At one point, the man leaned slightly toward her and said something. She smiled again. That same quiet smile I'd seen earlier. My chest tightened in a way that felt almost physical, like someone had reached inside and squeezed. I paused the footage again, running a hand slowly over my face. Maybe it's nothing, I muttered quietly. The words sounded weak even to my own ears. I'd always believed trust was one of the strongest parts of our marriage. We weren't perfect, no couple is, but we had always talked things through, supported each other, leaned on each other when life got heavy. Or at least, that's what I thought. I forced myself to keep watching. The next camera angle showed the elevator area. The man pressed the button, and they stood there waiting. My wife folded her arms loosely, then looked down at her phone for a second before slipping it back into her purse. The man said something else. She reached out and lightly touched his shoulder as she laughed again. That gesture hit harder than anything else. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was casual, comfortable, natural. The kind of touch people share when they've grown used to each other's presence. The elevator door slid open. They stepped inside together. And just like that, the camera view returned to an empty hallway. Silence filled the room around me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen long after the moment had passed. Part of me wanted to dig deeper, to check more cameras, follow every hallway, see exactly which room they entered. But another part of me hesitated. Because once I crossed that line, once I confirmed what my mind was already beginning to accept, there would be no pretending anymore. The truth would stop being a possibility. It would become something real. Something permanent. I sat there for a long time, the quiet glow of the screen reflecting in the dark window beside my desk. Somewhere in the city, my wife was spending the evening in a hotel room with another man. And for the first time in our entire marriage, I wasn't sure who she really was anymore. By the time the front door finally opened that night, I had already replayed the footage more times than I wanted to admit. Not because I needed to, but because some stubborn part of me kept hoping I had missed something, some small detail that would change the entire story. It never did. So when I heard the soft click of the door and the quiet rustle of her coat as she stepped inside, my chest tightened in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. "Hey," she called out gently. Her voice sounded normal. Calm. The same tone she'd used thousands of times before when coming home after a long day. I looked up from the couch. "There you are," she said with a small smile as she slipped off her shoes near the door. For a moment, I just watched her. If I hadn't seen the security footage earlier, I never would have suspected anything. She looked the same as always, relaxed, composed, carrying that quiet confidence that had first drawn me to her years ago. She walked toward me and set her bag down on the table. "Long day?" I asked. "Very," she said with a soft sigh. Then she stepped closer and wrapped her arms around me. The hug caught me slightly off guard. Her arms rested around my shoulders, warm and familiar. Her cheek brushed gently against mine as she held me for a second longer than usual. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing. For a brief moment, my mind betrayed me. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the footage meant something different. Maybe there was an explanation I hadn't considered. I returned the hug automatically, my hands resting lightly against her back. "You smell tired," I joked quietly. She laughed softly against my shoulder. "Is that your polite way of saying I smell bad?" "No," I said, forcing a small smile. "Just honest." She pulled back slightly, studying my face with a playful expression. "Careful," she said. "Honesty can be dangerous." The irony of those words settled heavily in my chest. We moved into the living room together, sitting down on opposite sides of the couch. She tucked one leg under herself comfortably, glancing briefly at her phone before placing it face down on the coffee table. "How was your evening?" I asked. "Just meetings," she said with a small shrug. "Nothing exciting." Her tone was casual, almost automatic. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept the answer. Inside, my mind replayed the moment from the lobby camera, her smiling at the other man, the way they had hugged. But sitting there beside her, watching her brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear, it was hard to connect that image with the woman in front of me. She leaned back into the couch cushions and stretched slightly. "Honestly, I'm exhausted," she said. Without thinking, she reached over and placed her hand on mine. Her fingers wrapped gently around my hand, squeezing once in that familiar affectionate way she'd always had. The warmth of the touch sent a strange wave of emotion through me. Because it felt real. It felt sincere. And that made everything hurt even more. We sat there quietly for a moment, the television playing softly in the background. If someone had walked into the room, they would have seen a perfectly normal couple spending a quiet evening together. But beneath the calm surface, something heavy hung in the air. A truth I already knew. And a secret she didn't realize I had discovered. She rested her head briefly against my shoulder, comfortable and close. Meanwhile, I sat there staring at the dark reflection of the room in the television screen, feeling the weight of what I'd seen pressing harder against my chest. She had no idea that I knew where she'd really been that evening. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend I didn't. The next evening, the house felt heavier than usual. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same quiet rooms, the same soft evening light coming through the windows, the same familiar sounds of the neighborhood outside. But inside me, something had shifted overnight. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same images again, the lobby camera, the hug, the way she smiled when she saw him. By the time she walked through the door that evening, I had already made a decision. We couldn't keep pretending. "Hey," she said gently as she stepped inside. Her tone carried that same casual warmth as always. She placed her bag on the table and glanced toward the living room, where I was sitting. "You're home early," she added with a small smile. "Yeah," I replied quietly. Something in my voice must have sounded different. Her smile faded slightly as she walked closer, studying my face with a hint of concern. "Everything okay?" she asked. For a moment, I didn't answer. Instead, I gestured toward the couch beside me. "Can we sit for a minute?" She hesitated, just briefly, before nodding. "Of course." She sat down beside me, turning slightly so she could face me. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a small tension in her shoulders now, like she sensed something serious was coming. I took a slow breath. "There's something I need to ask you," I said. "Okay," she replied cautiously. My hands rested loosely together as I spoke. "Where were you the other night?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "At my meeting," she said. "I told you that." Her answer came quickly. Too quickly. I nodded slowly. "And that meeting happened to be at a hotel downtown." The moment the words left my mouth, the color drained from her face. Her eyes widened just slightly. How do you know that?" she asked. I held her gaze for a moment before answering. "Because I own that hotel." The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. She blinked, clearly trying to process what I had just said. I don't understand," she murmured. "There are security cameras in the lobby," I continued gently. "I check them sometimes when I review the business reports." Her breathing became slower, heavier. "And I saw you," I said quietly. She looked down at her hands. "And I saw the man you met." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she closed her eyes briefly, as if the truth had finally caught up with her. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," I replied. Her shoulders sank slightly, the tension in her posture collapsing into something closer to defeat. Tears slowly gathered in her eyes, though she didn't try to hide them. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said softly. I didn't interrupt. She rubbed her hands together nervously before continuing. "We've been distant for a while," she admitted. "I felt lonely, and I made a mistake." Her voice trembled on the last words. I didn't plan for it to go this far. Hearing her say it out loud hurt more than watching the footage. Because now it wasn't just an image on a screen. It was real. I sat there quietly, letting the silence stretch between us. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said through a shaky breath. I believed that part. But belief didn't make the pain disappear. After a moment, I spoke again. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy?" She looked up at me, tears sliding slowly down her cheeks. I didn't know how. The room fell quiet again. Two people sitting on the same couch, separated by a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. The room stayed quiet for a long time after her words faded. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. It was strange how something so small suddenly felt so loud in the silence between us. My wife wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, trying to steady her breathing. Her eyes stayed lowered, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to meet my gaze again. I sat there beside her, feeling the weight of everything that had just been said. Part of me had expected anger, shouting, accusations, something explosive. But that wasn't what filled the room. Instead, there was something quieter. Sadness. The kind that settles slowly into your chest when you realize something important has already changed. "I wish I could take it back," she said softly after a while. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I know," I replied. And strangely enough, I believed that too. The woman sitting next to me wasn't some stranger. She was still the same person I had laughed with, traveled with, planned a future with. The same person whose hand I had held countless times before. But something fragile between us had cracked. And neither of us knew how to fix it. She finally looked up at me again. "What happens now?" she asked. It was the question we had both been avoiding. I leaned back slightly, staring at the floor as I searched for the right words. "I don't think we can pretend this didn't happen," I said carefully. She nodded slowly. "I know." Her fingers twisted together in her lap, nervous and uncertain. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. The honesty in her voice hurt more than anything else. Because losing each other had never been part of the plan. But love alone doesn't always erase betrayal. I turned toward her again. "Right now, I think we both need space," I said. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth. She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded again, tears quietly returning to her eyes. "That's fair," she murmured. For a moment, we simply sat there together, absorbing the reality of the decision. Finally, she stood up slowly. "I should probably stay with my sister for a while," she said. "That might be a good idea," I replied gently. She walked toward the hallway, pausing near the doorway before turning back toward me. There was a long hesitation in her eyes, like she was trying to memorize the moment. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. The hug was tighter than the one from the night before. Her hands gripped the back of my shirt slightly, trembling as she held on. For a second, I closed my eyes and returned the embrace. It felt familiar. And painfully final at the same time. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were red but calm. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "You too," I replied. She picked up her bag, walked to the door, and stepped outside. The door closed gently behind her. I stayed there on the couch for a long time afterward, staring at the quiet room around me. Sometimes betrayal ends with anger. Sometimes it ends with chaos. But sometimes, it ends with two people realizing that the life they once shared has quietly come to an end. And learning to walk away from it with whatever pieces of respect still remain.